The spring of 1861 was a season of profound political and social fracture within the United States. The election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in November 1860 served as a catalyst for a movement that had been simmering for decades. Southern political leaders, primarily from states whose economies were deeply entrenched in the plantation system and the institution of slavery, perceived the ascension of a Republican president whose party platform opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories as an existential threat to their social order and economic interests. This perception triggered a rapid sequence of secessions. South Carolina was the first to declare its separation from the Union on December 20th, 1860. It was followed over the ensuing weeks by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These 7 states formally constituted the Confederate States of America on February 4, 1861, in Montgomery, Alabama, establishing a provisional government and electing Jefferson Davis as their president. The immediate and most volatile point of confrontation was the status of federal property within the seceded states. Fort Sumter, a garrison situated on a man-made island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, became the symbol of the standoff. The fort, under the command of Major Robert Anderson, remained under the United States flag, while the state of South Carolina considered it rightfully theirs. Diplomatic efforts to provision the fort failed. On April 12, 1861, after a formal demand for surrender was refused, Confederate forces under the command of General Pierre G.T. Beauregard commenced a bombardment of Fort Sumter. The fort, heavily outgunned and unable to effectively return fire, surrendered after 34 hours of shelling. This event had an immediate and electrifying effect on the nation. President Lincoln, interpreting the attack as an armed rebellion, issued a call on April 15th for 75,000 volunteers from the state militias to serve for a period of 90 days. The stated objective was to suppress the insurrection and to cause the laws to be duly executed. Lincoln's call for troops fundamentally altered the nature of the crisis. It forced the states of the Upper South to choose a side. Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, which had previously resisted secession, now refused to provide troops to coerce their sister southern states. Instead, they declared their own secession and joined the Confederacy. The Confederate capital was subsequently moved from Montgomery to the more politically and symbolically significant city of Richmond, Virginia. This geographic shift placed the 2 rival capitals, Washington and Richmond, a mere 100 miles apart, ensuring that the state of Virginia would become the primary military theater of the war's Eastern Theater. In the northern states, the attack on Fort Sumter and the president's call to arms provoked an overwhelming wave of patriotic fervor. Public meetings were held in town squares, and recruitment offices were flooded with volunteers. The prevailing sentiment, echoed by newspaper editors, political leaders, and the general populace, was one of confident superiority and a belief in a short, decisive conflict. The industrial and population advantages of the North were widely cited as insurmountable for the agrarian South. The phrase, "On to Richmond," became a ubiquitous slogan, a reflection of the public's expectation for a single crushing offensive that would capture the Confederate capital, disperse its government, and end the rebellion before the summer was out. This 90-day war narrative was not merely popular optimism. It was a foundational assumption upon which initial Union strategy was built. The military reality for both sides, however, stood in stark contrast to this public enthusiasm. The United States Army in early 1861 was a small, decentralized force of approximately 16,000 men, most of whom were stationed in remote outposts in the West. Its officer corps was immediately thrown into crisis, as many of its most experienced members were Southerners who felt their primary allegiance was to their home states. Approximately 1/3 of the U.S. Army's officers, including esteemed figures like Colonel Robert E. Lee, who had been offered field command of the Union Army by Lincoln, resigned their commissions to join the Confederate cause. This brain drain of professional military leadership was a severe initial blow to the Union. The task of organizing the vast influx of volunteers into a coherent fighting force fell to the aging General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott, a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, Scott was a brilliant strategist, but was now 75 years old, suffering from gout and obesity, and unable to take the field. His initial strategic proposal, which would later be known as the Anaconda Plan, was a long-term strategy involving a naval blockade of southern ports and a major thrust down the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in two. However, this plan was publicly derided as too slow and passive. The political pressure for an immediate, decisive offensive against Richmond was immense and ultimately dictated military policy. The field command of the principal Union force, designated the Army of Northeastern Virginia, was given to Brigadier General Irvin McDowell. A career soldier with a solid record as a staff officer in the Mexican-American War, McDowell was nevertheless a political appointment who had never commanded troops in combat. He was acutely aware of the deficiencies of his army. The regiments assembling in and around Washington were composed of 90-day militiamen. They were enthusiastic, but utterly raw. They lacked basic discipline, musketry training, and knowledge of field maneuvers. Units from different states often had different uniforms and equipment. McDowell argued forcefully for time to drill his men, to instill discipline, and to form a cohesive army. The political authorities, including President Lincoln and Secretary of War Simon Cameron, were sympathetic but unmovable. The 90-day enlistments were ticking down, and public demand for action was a force of its own. Lincoln's message to McDowell was pragmatic. The Southern forces were just as green, and delay would only allow them to improve. Facing the Union threat was the Confederate Army of the Potomac, commanded by General Pierre G.T. Beauregard. After his role at Fort Sumter, Beauregard was hailed as a hero in the South and given command of the most critical sector. His force, roughly comparable in size to McDowell's, was similarly composed of short-term volunteers and militia. They were ill-equipped, with a patchwork of uniforms and a dire shortage of artillery and other supplies. Beauregard chose a defensive position along the south bank of Bull Run, a sluggish, tree-lined stream with steep, muddy banks that presented a significant military obstacle. His lines stretched for several miles, guarding the vital Manassas Junction Railroad hub, which connected the Shenandoah Valley to northern Virginia. This position blocked the most direct overland route from Washington to Richmond. McDowell's operational plan, presented in mid-July, was tactically sophisticated and, if executed by a veteran army, had a high chance of success. He intended to demonstrate against the Confederate center, where the Warrenton Turnpike crossed Bull Run at the Stone Bridge, to fix Beauregard's attention. The main effort, however, would be a wide flanking march. 2 full divisions, under Brigadier Generals David Hunter and Samuel Heintzelman, would march northwest under cover of darkness, cross Bull Run at Sudley Springs Ford, and descend upon the Confederate left flank, which was believed to be weak and exposed. The success of this turning movement hinged entirely on the elements of speed and surprise. The Union Army began its advance from its camps around Washington on the afternoon of July 16, 1861. The march immediately exposed the Army's profound lack of preparation. The column, stretching for miles, was a disorganized procession. The soldiers, many of them city clerks and laborers unaccustomed to sustained physical exertion, marched poorly. Discipline broke down repeatedly. Men broke ranks to rest, fill canteens, or forage for blackberries in the Virginia countryside. The roads, narrow and dusty, became clogged with the immense wagon trains necessary to supply the army, further slowing the infantry. The march, intended to be swift, became a slow, exhausting crawl. What was planned as a one-day march to Centerville, a small town just east of Bull Run, took 2 full days. This delay was militarily significant. It provided the Confederates with crucial intelligence and time to react. Beauregard was aware of the Union advance almost from its inception. His cavalry scouts, notably the horsemen under Colonel J.E.B. Stuart, reported on the Union movements. Furthermore, Beauregard had a signal station on a high point known as Signal Hill, which used flag signals to communicate. He understood that his force was likely outnumbered and that a purely static defense was risky. He had previously requested reinforcements from the other major Confederate force in the region, General Joseph E. Johnston's army in the Shenandoah Valley. Johnston's role was to pin down Union forces in the valley, but he was given discretion to evade them and reinforce Beauregard if the primary threat developed in northern Virginia. The Union command in the Shenandoah, led by the aged and cautious General Robert Patterson, failed in its mission. Confused by feints and cavalry screens, Patterson believed Johnston's army was still in front of him in full strength. In reality, Johnston, upon receiving orders from Richmond, began skillfully disengaging and marching his infantry to the Manassas Gap Railroad. This was a landmark moment in military history, the first strategic use of railroads to rapidly concentrate forces for a battle. While McDowell's army was slowly marching on foot, Johnston's brigades were being shuttled by train directly to the battlefield. The lead elements, under Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson, began arriving at Manassas Junction on July 19. This movement fundamentally altered the strategic picture, effectively merging the two Confederate armies and negating the Union's numerical advantage. By July 20th, the bulk of both armies were concentrated in the vicinity of Bull Run. McDowell's army, now concentrated around Centerville, numbered approximately 35,000 men, though not all were effective combatants. The combined Confederate forces under Beauregard and Johnston now also numbered roughly 35,000. Johnston, as the senior officer, deferred tactical command to Beauregard, who was more familiar with the ground. Beauregard devised an aggressive plan of his own for July 21st, a flanking attack on the Union left. However, the complexities of command and control in an inexperienced army meant that his orders were vague, poorly disseminated, and ultimately, his attack never materialized. Instead, the initiative remained with McDowell. In the pre-dawn hours of July 21st, the Union Army began its movement. The flanking columns under Hunter and Heintzelman started their long march towards Sudley Springs. The plan began to unravel almost immediately. The march was slower than anticipated. The troops were tired from the previous day's exertions, and the route was narrow and difficult. The lead elements did not begin crossing Bull Run until after 9:00 a.m., hours behind schedule. The demonstration at the Stone Bridge, conducted by the division of Brigadier General Daniel Tyler, was also poorly executed. Tyler, perhaps overly aggressive, pushed a brigade forward to probe a nearby ford at Blackburn's Ford, which created some noise and confusion, but failed to fully deceive Beauregard about the main point of attack. The Confederate left flank was initially held by a small brigade under Colonel Nathan Shanks Evans, a vigilant and aggressive commander. Evans had been watching the Union activity at the Stone Bridge, but when he observed dust clouds rising from the direction of Sudley Springs and received a signal message warning of a large Union force crossing there, he made a critical decision. Leaving a token force to watch the bridge, he rapidly marched the bulk of his brigade north to a new defensive position on the Matthews Hill. He was soon reinforced by the brigades of Brigadier Generals Barnard B. and Francis Bartow, who brought their troops up from the Confederate center after hearing the growing sound of musketry. The battle opened in earnest around 10:30 a.m. on Matthews Hill. The Union advance guard, the brigade of Colonel Ambrose Burnside, deployed into line of battle and advanced against Evans's waiting troops. The fighting was intense and chaotic from the start. The Union troops, attacking in long textbook lines, pressed forward against the outnumbered Confederates. The noise was a continuous, deafening roar, the massed volleys of thousands of rifled muskets punctuated by the blast of cannon. The air filled with thick white smoke that limited visibility to a few dozen yards, causing units to fire on their own comrades and creating a pervasive sense of disorientation. For the soldiers on both sides, this was their first experience of combat. The romantic ideals of warfare vanished in the face of its brutal reality. The whirring sound of Minié balls, the concussive force of artillery shells, and the sight of men screaming and falling with grievous wounds. Despite their inexperience, the Union troops showed determination. Their numerical weight began to tell. After a fierce firefight lasting over an hour, the Confederate line on Matthews Hill began to crumble. Evans, B, and Bartow's brigades were forced to retreat in disarray, falling back across the Warrenton Turnpike and towards a key piece of terrain to their rear. a long open plateau crowned by the house of Judith Henry, known as Henry House Hill. The Union attack appeared to be on the verge of a decisive victory. The Confederate left flank had been turned, and a disorganized mass of Southern troops was retreating towards the rear. It was at this critical moment, between 1:00 and 2:00 p.m., that the battle turned. The retreating Confederate brigades were met on the reverse slope of Henry House Hill by a fresh, steady brigade that had been held in reserve. Its commander was Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson. His Virginia brigade had arrived by train the previous day and was now formed in a strong defensive line. As General B attempted to rally his shattered Alabama and Mississippi troops, he reportedly gestured toward Jackson's unbroken line and shouted to his men, "Look, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." The historical accuracy of the exact phrase is debated, but its effect was immediate and enduring. Jackson's steadfastness provided a psychological and physical anchor for the panicked Confederates. The name Stonewall Jackson was born in that moment, and his brigade became the legendary Stonewall Brigade. The focus of the battle now shifted to Henry House Hill. The Union forces, having advanced successfully for over 2 hours, were now exhausted and disorganized. Their formations were intermingled, and command and control were breaking down. McDowell, lacking an experienced staff, found it difficult to coordinate a fresh, concentrated assault. Instead, the Union attacks against the new Confederate line on the hill were piecemeal and uncoordinated. Regiments were fed into the fight 1 or 2 at a time. The fighting on the hill was a confused and bloody stalemate. The thick smoke led to a tragic incident where a key Union artillery battery, commanded by Captain James Ricketts, was overrun by the 33rd Virginia Infantry, whose soldiers were wearing blue uniforms, leading Ricketts to hesitate to fire on them, believing they were friendly troops. The capture of these guns was a severe blow to Union morale. For nearly 2 hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Both sides were fully committed and fighting tenaciously. The arrival of final Confederate reinforcements proved decisive. The last of Johnston's brigades from the Shenandoah Valley, including the fresh troops of Colonel Jubal A. Early, arrived on the field and were immediately directed to extend the Confederate left and threaten the Union right flank. At approximately 4:00 p.m., Beauregard and Johnston, sensing the Union attacks were losing their vigor, ordered a general counterattack along the entire line. The order was simple: advance. The effect was dramatic. The weary Union soldiers, having given their maximum effort, and now facing a screaming, determined line of fresh and reinvigorated Confederate troops, began to yield. A withdrawal from Henry House Hill began. What started as a controlled, fighting retreat soon degenerated into a rout. The primary retreat route was across the Stone Bridge and a nearby farm ford, back up the Warrenton Turnpike towards Centerville and Washington. The road quickly became a scene of utter chaos. The Union retreat coincided with the departure of the many civilian spectators, congressmen, society figures, journalists, who had come out from Washington with picnic baskets to watch the anticipated Union victory. Their carriages, wagons, and horses now clogged the narrow road, intermingling with panicked soldiers, artillery caissons, and supply wagons. A sense of terror swept through the disorganized mass. A cry went up: "Black Horse Cavalry!" referring to a feared Confederate cavalry unit. Though the threat was largely imagined, it was enough to trigger a stampede. Soldiers threw away their rifles, knapsacks, and coats to run faster. Officers tried in vain to stem the tide, but discipline had completely collapsed. The army had ceased to exist as a fighting force and had become a terrified mob. The rain, which began to fall heavily that evening, turned the roads to mud, adding to the misery and despair. The Confederates, however, were in no condition to mount an effective pursuit. They were as exhausted and disorganized by their defensive victory as the Union was by its defeat. A planned pursuit by Johnston was cancelled due to the chaotic state of the Confederate Army. The Union forces straggled back into the defenses of Washington over the next 2 days, a humiliated and demoralized collection of men. The casualty figures from the battle, though modest by the horrific standards that would later be set at Antietam or Gettysburg, were a profound shock to the nation. The Union Army suffered approximately 896 casualties, 460 killed, 124 wounded, and 312 captured or missing. The Confederate Army lost approximately 982, 387 killed, 582 wounded, and 13 missing. The numbers made it clear that this would not be a bloodless conflict. The reports in northern newspapers described not a glorious victory, but a humiliating defeat, detailing the chaotic retreat and the abandonment of the wounded. The psychological and political impact of the Battle of Bull Run was immediate and transformative. In the South, the victory produced an explosion of confidence and euphoria. The belief in the martial superiority of the Southern soldier became an article of faith. The Richmond press and public celebrated their heroes, Beauregard, Johnston, and especially the new legend, Stonewall Jackson. There was a widespread feeling that the war was all but won, that one more such victory would secure Southern independence. This confidence, however, also bred a certain complacency and an underestimation of the North's resolve and capacity for a long war. In the North, the initial reaction was one of stunned disbelief, which quickly hardened into a grim and determined realism. The illusions of a 90-day war were utterly shattered. The New York Tribune, which had championed the "On to Richmond" cry, now editorialized about the need for a prolonged, serious struggle. The defeat served as a brutal but necessary awakening. It stripped away the romantic notions of war and revealed it as a brutal, costly, and uncertain enterprise. Politically, it ended any lingering sentiment for a negotiated settlement. The war would now be fought to a conclusive finish. The most significant consequences of Bull Run were the profound strategic and institutional changes it forced upon the Union. President Lincoln and his administration acted with remarkable speed and decisiveness in the wake of the defeat. The first and most critical realization was that the system of 90-day militia was completely inadequate for the task at hand. On July 25th, just 4 days after the battle, Congress passed a bill authorizing the enlistment of 500 Dauersamert volunteers for 3-year terms. This was a monumental shift, signaling the commitment to a long war of attrition. The call for 3-year volunteers was the true birth of a standing national army for the Union. The defeat also necessitated a change in military leadership. General Irvin McDowell, though his plan had been sound and his execution hampered by the greenness of his troops, was relieved of field command. He was replaced by Major General George Brinton McClellan. The 34-year-old McClellan had won a series of small but well-publicized victories in Western Virginia and was seen as a rising star. He arrived in Washington on July 26th and was given command of what would soon be reorganized as the Army of the Potomac. McClellan's mandate was not to launch an immediate offensive, but to build, train, and organize. McClellan proved to be a masterful organizer and administrator. He was a perfectionist with an immense capacity for detail. He instituted a rigorous regimen of drill, discipline, and large-scale maneuvers. He reorganized the army into corps, improved its logistical and supply systems, and instilled a powerful sense of pride and professionalism in his men. He was a charismatic leader who referred to his soldiers as his comrades, and they, in turn, developed an intense loyalty to him, often calling him Little Mac. Under his command over the fall and winter of 1861-1862, the Army of the Potomac was transformed from the demoralized mob that had fled from Bull Run into a magnificent, well-equipped, and highly disciplined fighting force of over 100 Wauwaunan men. This creation of a professional army was the single most important strategic outcome of the Bull Run defeat. Furthermore, the battle forced a fundamental re-evaluation of Union grand strategy. General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, which had been dismissed before the battle, was now seen in a new light. A direct overland thrust to Richmond was clearly not a simple undertaking. The war would have to be fought on multiple fronts, combining the naval blockade with major operations in the Western Theater along the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers, while the primary Eastern Army was built and prepared for a more methodical, large-scale campaign. The concept of hard war, of targeting the Confederate infrastructure and economic capacity, began to take root as a necessary component of victory. The experience of Bull Run also had a lasting impact on the soldiers and the conduct of the war itself. It was the first major battle involving significant use of the telegraph for communication and the railroad for strategic troop movement. It demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of the rifled musket, which extended the killing zone and made Napoleonic-style frontal assaults far more costly. The reports from the field introduced the American public to the realities of modern combat, the impersonal nature of death at long range, the chaos of the battlefield obscured by smoke, and the critical importance of logistics, command, and control. The romantic Napoleonic ideal of war was dead. In the months that followed, as McClellan meticulously built his army, political and public pressure for another offensive began to mount once again. The press coined the derisive phrase, "all quiet along the Potomac," to criticize McClellan's perceived inactivity. Yet McClellan, forever cautious and convinced he faced overwhelming Confederate numbers, resisted these pressures. He was determined not to repeat McDowell's mistake of committing a half-trained army to battle. He was building an instrument, not for a single battle, but for a prolonged campaign aimed at the capture of Richmond and the destruction of the Confederate army. The Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, was not a decisive battle in the sense that it determined the final outcome of the Civil War. However, its role as a pivotal moment of strategic awakening for the Union cannot be overstated. It was a traumatic but essential lesson that forced a total rethinking of the nation's approach to the conflict. The shock of defeat catalyzed the creation of a massive professional standing army, a more comprehensive national strategy, and a hardened political will committed to unconditional victory. The road to Appomattox began not with a victory, but with the humiliating defeat on the banks of Bull Run. The innocence of 1861 was gone, replaced by the sobering understanding that preserving the Union would require a long, brutal, and total war, fought not by temporary volunteers, but by a nation fully mobilized for a struggle whose end, in the summer of 1861, was nowhere in sight. The Union's road to victory had to be completely rethought, and it was the reality of Bull Run that provided the harsh, necessary blueprint.